The Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly over the long gravel driveway leading to Thorne Manor, a majestic, ancient estate nestled within a vast estate lined with towering oak trees on either side. The pale gray sky signaled a chilly autumn afternoon. Fallen leaves rustled on the ground, carried by a crisp breeze that hinted at the approaching winter. Inside the car, Catherine Langley sat with her arms crossed, her brown eyes filled with discontent as she observed the scenery outside. She raised an eyebrow, turning toward Alexander Thorne, the man sitting beside her with a look of calm pride on his face. "Alexander, is this what you call home?" Her voice stretched, filled with both disbelief and skepticism. Alexander smirked slightly, his gaze remaining on the road ahead. "Yes, this has been my family's home for generations." Catherine shook her head, her gaze sweeping over the ancient trees, the creeping ivy on stone walls, and the distant silhouette of a massive, old-world mansion. "Seriously? I thought it would be like a luxury resort, like the hotels you own, not some kind of," she scoffed, gesturing toward the looming structure. "Medieval castle." Catherine leaned back in her seat, exhaling a long breath. Alexander remained silent, stealing a glance at her. He had anticipated this reaction. She leaned forward, pressing her hand against the car window, studying the estate more closely as it became clearer through the misty afternoon light. The dark gray stone walls, the steep black-tiled roofs, the tall, narrow windows adorned with thick velvet curtains. Everything exuded an air of antiquity, a silent testament to a bygone era. Catherine frowned even more deeply. "It looks like an old museum. Are you sure it's safe to live here?" She scoffed, her tone teasing, but her disappointment was evident. Alexander chuckled lightly, but his gaze sharpened. "Catherine, this is not just a house. This is my family's history." She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms again. "History or just a pile of outdated ruins?" Alexander pressed his lips together, choosing not to respond. He had always known that Catherine disliked anything old-fashioned, but he had not expected her disdain to be so blunt. A strange feeling had crept into his chest, a small but undeniable doubt. The car slowly came to a halt at the foot of the grand stone staircase, leading up to the massive oak doors of the manor. Outside, a row of estate staff stood in a perfectly straight line, waiting to welcome their master home. At the center of them stood Eleanor, tall and composed, her face calm but her eyes filled with quiet anticipation. The wind gently ruffled the long gray dress she always wore, yet Eleanor remained poised, dignified as ever. The car door opened. Alexander stepped out first, adjusting the collar of his coat, his gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings, a sense of nostalgia and deep appreciation filling his chest. Then Catherine stepped out. She shivered slightly, pulling her coat tighter around her as the cold air brushed against her skin. Her eyes drifted over every detail of the manor. The ancient stone steps, the intricately carved statues dusted with moss, the heavy stained glass windows. She frowned, gripping the strap of her designer handbag a little tighter. "My God, this place is like a haunted castle," she muttered under her breath, low enough that Alexander wouldn't hear. But Eleanor, standing nearby, caught every word. Catherine smirked slightly, then glanced at the assembled servants, all dressed neatly, standing with silent obedience. And then her gaze landed on Eleanor, the only one who did not lower her head, but instead observed her with a quiet, assessing look. Catherine felt something unsettling about that gaze. This servant was not like any she had ever encountered before. Thorne Manor was bathed in the warm glow of candlelight as night fell. The chandeliers cast a soft golden hue, reflecting off the polished marble floors. The air was solemn yet familiar, at least to Alexander. Eleanor, clad in her perfectly pressed gray uniform, stepped forward as Alexander and Catherine entered the grand hall. She stood tall, hands clasped in front of her, like an unshakable pillar of the Thorne household, a woman who had witnessed generations grow up under this very roof. "Master Alexander, you've returned." Her voice was steady, unchanged by the years. It carried neither overbearing warmth nor cold distance, but instead the weight of a lifetime dedicated to this family. Alexander stepped forward and embraced Eleanor without hesitation. "I missed you, Eleanor." She smiled faintly, giving him a light pat on the back, just as she used to do when he was a boy. "You've been away too long." Catherine stood nearby, smiling, but not entirely genuinely. Her gaze swept over Eleanor, From the simple yet pristine dress, the neatly tied gray hair, to the calm yet authoritative demeanor that made her seem like more than just a servant, more like a part of this household itself. When Alexander turned to introduce them, Catherine blinked once, then flashed a dazzling smile. "Oh, really? Alexander has spoken so much about you. Thank you." Eleanor responded briefly, her expression remaining composed. Catherine extended her hand delicately, but Eleanor could tell right away that this handshake was empty of any real sentiment. Sure enough, the moment Eleanor's hand touched hers, Catherine withdrew immediately, as if it was nothing more than a mere formality. "It's wonderful to know that you're still working here. I would have thought someone like you had retired long ago." Mariah Thorne, Alexander's aunt, who had been observing the entire exchange, arched an eyebrow slightly. Mariah was a woman of refinement, elegant yet sharp, and she never missed even the subtlest of expressions on someone's face. "Eleanor is an integral part of this family, Catherine." Mariah's voice was soft, yet carried an undeniable weight. Catherine laughed sweetly, pretending not to notice the underlying disapproval. "Of course, Aunt Mariah, I just meant that everyone deserves some rest at a certain age." Eleanor glanced briefly at Alexander, but he only pressed his lips together, saying nothing. Dinner was held in the grand dining hall, where the portraits of past Thorne ancestors hung solemnly on the walls, as if they were silent spectators of the evening's events. Seated at the table were Mariah Thorne, Alexander's aunt, a poised and perceptive woman; James Thorne, Alexander's cousin, a quiet but observant man; Henry Thorne, Alexander's youngest brother, a more free-spirited but respectful young man. Catherine slowly looked around, her eyes glinting with silent judgment. "This really feels like stepping into a banquet from another century." Mariah glanced at Catherine, her smile remaining polite, but her gaze turned slightly colder. "Our family values tradition." Eleanor stood quietly nearby, overseeing the dinner, as she had done for years. Catherine picked up her wineglass, swirling it gently. "Actually, I was just thinking," she began, casting a glance at Alexander. "Maybe some things here could use a little update, like this antique dinnerware, or perhaps the way everything is so formal." James looked up from his plate, his brows drawing together slightly, though he remained silent. Mariah set her glass down gently, her voice as smooth as silk. "Catherine, we take great pride in preserving the things that have belonged to this household for hundreds of years. It is not something to be altered lightly." Catherine smirked slightly, shrugging. "Of course, I was only offering a suggestion. After all, I'll soon be part of the family." Mariah let out a soft chuckle, though her smile lacked warmth. "Indeed, if that happens." Catherine paused for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, flashing another polite smile. As dinner drew to a close, Catherine slowly swirled her wineglass again. Then, in a seemingly accidental movement, tilted her hand, spilling the deep red liquid onto Eleanor's dress. The crimson stain spread across Eleanor's gray fabric, dark and unmistakable. Eleanor remained still, showing no sign of distress. Catherine inhaled sharply, then placed a delicate hand over her mouth, exclaiming in a honeyed voice, "Oh dear, how clumsy of me." Yet she made no move to help Eleanor clean it up. Mariah set her fork down slowly, her sharp eyes zeroing in on Catherine, as if she had finally seen the true nature of the woman before her. Alexander watched the scene unfold, a tight discomfort settling in his chest. Eleanor calmly took a napkin, dabbing at the stain, before looking up at Catherine with an icy gaze. "No worries, Miss Langley. I've become quite accustomed to these sorts of accidents." Catherine smiled softly, her eyes flickering with something akin to quiet triumph. Alexander tightened his grip on his wineglass, his jaw clenching slightly, but he said nothing. For the first time, a question surfaced in his mind, one he could no longer ignore. Had he made a mistake? The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Thorne Manor's grand sitting room, casting long golden streaks across the thick Persian rug. Catherine sat elegantly on a velvet-upholstered armchair, one leg crossed over the other, her slender fingers lightly caressing the rim of a delicate porcelain teacup. Outside, Eleanor stood in the grand hallway, overseeing the staff as they dusted, polished, and arranged everything to perfection. She wore a simple yet pristine gray dress, her silver-streaked hair neatly pinned into a bun, moving with her usual careful, composed manner. A woman who had dedicated her entire life to preserving this household. Catherine watched her brown eyes gleaming with silent evaluation. She took a slow sip of tea before softly calling out, her voice sweet as honey, yet laced with something unspoken. Alexander. Seated across from her, Alexander lowered his newspaper, looking up at her with mild curiosity. Yes, my love? Catherine set her teacup down onto the saucer, her movements graceful yet deliberate, her expression turning thoughtful, almost pensive. She let out a soft sigh, as though what she was about to say had weighed on her mind for quite some time. I've been thinking a lot about this house. She began, her gaze sweeping over the ornate, traditional decor before settling back on Alexander. You know how much I want to turn it into a place that truly suits our lifestyle, don't you? Alexander nodded, though a strange feeling began creeping into his chest. Yes, but why bring this up now? Catherine smiled faintly, tilting her head just slightly, her expression as soft as silk, but her eyes betrayed a sharper intent. She then turned her gaze back toward Eleanor, who was giving instructions to one of the maids. Leaning forward ever so slightly, Catherine lowered her voice, as if sharing a private, intimate thought. I think we should start with an important change. Alexander narrowed his eyes slightly, sensing something off in her tone. Catherine lifted her teacup again, took a measured sip, and then spoke casually. Eleanor has been working here for how long now? Over 40 years? Alexander frowned slightly, setting his newspaper aside. 42 years. Catherine nodded as if confirming a fact that had already been decided in her mind. Then don't you think it's time for her to retire? The air in the room grew noticeably heavier. Though Eleanor continued her work, she heard every single word. Alexander blinked several times as if trying to process what he had just heard. Catherine, what exactly are you saying? Catherine smiled again, tilting her head sweetly, but her words were as sharp as a blade. You know, a new home, a new lifestyle, sometimes requires new people. Her tone remained gentle, almost affectionate, but the underlying message was clear. She's been very loyal, of course, but she doesn't really fit into the vision we have, does she? Alexander froze, a familiar heat rising in his chest. Anger, disbelief, something sharp and undeniable. He slowly stood up, placing his hands on the arms of the chair, his voice lowering dangerously. Eleanor is not just a housekeeper, Catherine. Catherine let out a soft laugh, giving a graceful shrug as though she couldn't understand why he was reacting this way. I'm not saying she isn't dedicated. I just think sometimes people need to recognize when it's time to step aside. This time, Eleanor turned around, her gaze locking onto Catherine's. Her face remained composed, but there was a quiet, unshakable strength in her eyes. I am still more than capable of doing my job, Miss Langley. Her voice was steady, filled with dignity and certainty. Catherine glanced her up and down, then let out a small, amused smirk. That's what you think. Alexander's jaw tightened, his piercing blue eyes darkening. Taking a step closer to Catherine, his voice dropped to a low, firm tone filled with authority. This conversation is over. Catherine pressed her lips together, but she wasn't done yet. Slowly, she reached out, placing a delicate hand on Alexander's arm, her eyes softening, her voice melodious and coaxing. Alexander, I'm only trying to do what's best for both of us. But this time, Alexander wasn't falling for it. He pulled his arm away, stepping back, his expression unreadable but firm as stone. Eleanor isn't going in anywhere. Catherine blinked, her composure faltering for just a second before she regained her sweet smile, as if she still had control over the situation. All right, darling, if that's what you want. She casually lifted her teacup again, taking a sip before murmuring almost to herself, I just hope you won't regret it. The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud, and for the first time, Alexander knew Catherine wasn't going to let this go. The afternoon air hung heavy in the Thorne estate, the only sounds coming from the soft rustling of the wind through the open windows and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses as the house staff carefully polished them. As always, Eleanor was devoted to her work. She was dusting and organizing a display cabinet, ensuring that each priceless porcelain piece remained spotless. Her weathered but steady hands moved carefully, showing the precision of someone who had spent decades maintaining this household. Then suddenly a porcelain plate slipped from her grasp. Clink, crash! The delicate plate shattered upon impact, its fragments scattering across the marble floor. The entire room fell into silence. The house staff froze in place, their eyes flickering toward Eleanor with a mix of concern and uncertainty. No one dared to speak. Then a soft chuckle broke the silence. Catherine. She appeared at the top of the grand staircase, descending slowly, her movements graceful but calculated, her lips curving into a mocking smirk. "Oh dear, Eleanor." She raised a delicate hand to her lips, feigning surprise, but her eyes gleamed with amusement. She sauntered forward, the sharp click-clack of her heels echoing ominously through the room. "I suppose this is the clearest sign yet that your hands aren't as steady as they used to be." The words sliced through the air, laced with a cruelty that sent an uncomfortable tension through the onlookers. Eleanor did not react immediately. Instead, she calmly knelt down, her hands still firm, carefully picking up each fragment of porcelain. But Catherine wasn't finished. She crossed her arms, tilting her head just slightly, and continued. "I really didn't want to say anything, but doesn't this prove my point?" She turned toward Alexander, her eyes wide, innocent, pretending concern. "You see, Alexander, isn't this a perfect example of what I've been saying? Someone Eleanor's age should really consider retiring instead of continuing with work like this." Eleanor remained silent. Mariah, who had been watching from the corner of the room, set her teacup down with a sharp, deliberate clatter. "Catherine." Her voice was cold, authoritative, filled with warning. "Accidents like this can happen to anyone." Catherine blinked, then smiled slightly, as if she had been unfairly misunderstood. "Of course, Aunt Mariah, but—" She paused deliberately before her gaze drifted toward Eleanor once again. "Let's be honest, isn't she getting a bit too old for this?" This time Eleanor stood up. Her gaze met Catherine's directly, her expression calm yet unwavering. "I'm still more than capable of doing my job." Catherine let out a soft, amused chuckle. "Perhaps, but everyone has to face reality at some point. Don't they, Eleanor?" Alexander remained silent, but his grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles turning white. That evening, dinner at Thorne Manor carried an unmistakable tension. Seated directly across from Eleanor, Catherine played with her silverware, her fingers lightly tapping against the polished metal as if in deep thought. Then just as she lifted a fork full of food to her lips, she paused, and with an air of complete nonchalance, she spoke. "You know, I've been thinking, perhaps Eleanor should move to the servants' quarters instead." Alexander's cutlery came to an abrupt halt. The room went completely still. Eleanor blinked once, but showed no sign of surprise. Mariah set her utensils down, her gaze sharpening like a blade. "And why is that?" Catherine flashed a charming smile, her tone as sweet as ever, but her words dripping with venom. "Well, isn't it time for a housekeeper to relocate so that the future lady of the house can settle in properly?" James and Henry both stopped eating, their gazes lifting toward Catherine. For the first time, even James, the quiet and reserved one, looked displeased. Henry let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "Wow." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Did you really just say that out loud?" Catherine arched a delicate brow, still perfectly composed. "I'm simply being realistic, Henry." She set down her knife and fork carefully, her head tilting ever so slightly. "She's old. She might not be the best fit for this household anymore." Eleanor remained silent, but for the first time, she turned to Alexander. She didn't have to say a word. Her eyes spoke for her. She was waiting to see if the boy she had raised would finally say something, and Alexander said nothing. Nothing. The silence stretched painfully long, suffocating in its weight. Catherine glanced around, waiting for someone to agree with her, but no one did. So instead, she gave a small, amused smile as if she had just made a harmless observation. She picked up her wine glass, swirling the deep red liquid, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I'm simply thinking about what's best for everyone." Eleanor did not react, but for the first time, disappointment flickered in her eyes. Not disappointment in Catherine, disappointment in Alexander. The night was deep, yet Thorne Manor no longer felt as grand as it once did. Tonight it felt hollow and eerily quiet. Eleanor stood in her small room, her hands slowly folding each piece of clothing as if she were packing away an entire lifetime. On the old wooden table, a framed photograph of young Alexander remained. In the picture, the dark-haired boy with bright blue eyes clung tightly to her, his smile pure and untainted by the world. A knock echoed against the wooden door. Eleanor did not turn around, but she already knew who it was. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Alexander stepped inside. Under the dim golden light, his face looked exhausted and conflicted, his usually sharp blue eyes now clouded with an unfamiliar emptiness. "What are you doing?" His voice was hoarse, as if he had just lost something irreplaceable. Eleanor did not stop packing, her eyes focused on the old leather suitcase. Master Alexander, I believe I have been here long enough. Alexander took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. I don't want you to leave. This time Eleanor paused, turning to face Alexander. Her gaze no longer held the same warmth it once did. Now it was steady, distant, and resolute. You don't want me to leave? She repeated slowly, her voice firm and unwavering. But you let this happen. Alexander stood frozen. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes piercing through him. You stayed silent while I was humiliated. Her words struck him like a blade. He lowered his head, his fists tightening, but he had no argument to make. A heavy silence filled him. Eleanor lifted her suitcase, but before stepping out the door, she turned back, looking at Alexander one last time. If you don't stand up for what's right, you will lose far more than just a housekeeper. Alexander stood there, motionless, watching the woman who had been a part of his family walk away, knowing he had done nothing to stop it, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. Tutu, Alexander's awakening. His family confronts him. The next morning, Thorn Manor felt different. Eleanor was gone, but her presence still lingered in every corner, as if a vital piece of the house had been stripped away. Mariah, Henry, and James sat in the drawing room, but no one spoke immediately. Alexander sat across from them, his eyes vacant, staring into his untouched glass of whiskey, his mind a tangled mess. Finally, James broke the silence. Are you just going to sit there and pretend like nothing happened? Alexander flinched slightly, turning to look at his cousin. It already happened. His voice was dry, empty. James let out a sharp, humorless laugh, his eyes dark with disappointment. Yes, it happened, but you let it happen. Alexander had no rebuttal. Henry, the usually carefree one, spoke up next, his tone unusually serious. Alex, if Catherine can treat Eleanor that way, she can do the same to anyone, even to you. Mariah placed her teacup down on the table with a deliberate clink, her gaze unwavering. Have you ever considered this, Alexander? If Eleanor, who has been loyal to this family for over 40 years, can be discarded so easily, what makes you think you won't be next? A cold shiver ran down Alexander's spine. For the first time, he questioned something he had never thought to doubt before. 2. Alexander confronts. Catherine. That evening, Alexander stormed into the bedroom, where Catherine stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair with ease. Seeing him enter, she turned, smiling as if nothing had happened. Good evening, my love. She walked toward him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Her voice was seductive. You look tired. Is something wrong? Alexander didn't return her embrace. Instead, he gently pulled her hands away, stepping back, his gaze cold and unreadable. Eleanor is gone. Catherine shrugged, showing no sign of remorse. Good. That should have happened a long time ago. Alexander stared at her, anger boiling beneath his skin, his jaw tightening. You don't feel even the slightest bit guilty? Catherine laughed, rolling her eyes slightly, her amusement laced with irritation. Oh, Alexander, please, you're acting like she was a part of the family. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to control the fury surging inside him. She was family. For the first time, Catherine's smile faltered, but it was only for a second before she recovered, tilting her head slightly, her expression turning calculating. Alexander, this is your house. You have the right to make decisions. But if you don't change... She paused, her voice lowering. I'm not sure I can stay. That was the moment Alexander saw her for what she truly was. Catherine had never loved him. She only loved the power that came with being with him. The status, the wealth. And for the first time, he saw it all clearly. Eleanor had been right. If he didn't stand up for what was right, he wouldn't just lose her. He would lose everything that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, it was Catherine who needed to leave. Eleanor stood by the window of the small countryside house, gazing out at the starry night sky. A quiet feeling washed over her, not sadness, not regret, but a hollow sort of peace. She had left Thorn Manor, convinced that she no longer belonged there. But was that really true? The memories were still there, too vivid to ignore. The sound of Alexander's laughter as a child, the times he ran into her arms, burying his small face in her dress after waking from a nightmare. The warmth of the kitchen on winter nights, the whispered stories by the fireplace, the way his bright blue eyes looked up at her with unwavering trust. And now she was alone. A soft knock echoed against the wooden door. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Eleanor smiled faintly but didn't rush to open the door. "Come in, Alexander." The door creaked open. Alexander stepped inside, pausing in the doorway, his eyes filled with too many unspoken words. He was no longer the little boy she had once held in her arms. He was a grown man, powerful, commanding. Yet in her presence, his gaze still held something boyish, like a child searching for something he had lost. "Did you ever truly feel at home here?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled gently, but there was a trace of sadness in her expression. "No, Master Alexander." She shook her head softly. "My home has always been Thorn Manor." Alexander clenched his fists at his sides, as if fighting a battle within himself. Then suddenly he dropped to one knee before her, just like a child begging for forgiveness. "Then come home, Eleanor." His voice was raw, filled with emotion. "I let you leave once. I can't let it happen again." Eleanor reached out, gently touching his dark hair, the same way she had done when he was a boy. "I will come home," she said, and this time there was no hesitation. The next morning, everyone at Thorn Manor was waiting. Mariah stood at the top of the stone steps, arms crossed, but her eyes gave away her anticipation. Henry kept pacing near the entrance, peering out toward the driveway every few minutes. James remained silent, but even he was waiting. Then a sleek black car slowly pulled into the grand estate. As the door opened, Eleanor stepped out, her gaze sweeping over the manor, the place she had devoted her life to. For a brief moment, there was silence. And then someone gasped, "Mrs. Eleanor is back." The air filled with murmurs and whispers, then applause. One of the younger maids ran forward, tears spilling down her face as she threw her arms around Eleanor. "We missed you so much." Eleanor smiled softly, but this time she did not bow her head like a servant. She stood tall, returning not as a housekeeper, but as someone who truly belonged. Mariah stepped forward, assessing Eleanor for a moment, then gave a firm nod. "You're not leaving again, are you?" Eleanor let out a quiet chuckle. "No, I'm home for good." Alexander walked toward her, standing just inches away, but he didn't speak right away. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing gratitude, respect, and most of all, love in his eyes. "You're home now," he finally said, voice thick with emotion. Eleanor didn't reply. Instead, she reached up, gently touching his cheek, the same way she had done countless times when he was a boy. Alexander grasped her hand, holding on to it tightly, as if to make sure she would never leave again. That evening, a warm glow filled Thorn Manor as the fireplace crackled in the grand hall. Alexander and Eleanor sat together in the study, just as they had done so many times before. But this time there was no distance between them, no unspoken words, no lingering wounds, no doubts. Alexander lifted his glass of whiskey but didn't drink. Instead, he gazed at Eleanor, his voice steady and reflective. "I used to believe that wealth was what defined a man," he admitted, "but now I know. True wealth lies in the people who stand by you, no matter what." Eleanor smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. "You've finally learned, Master Alexander." There was no longer a lost little boy sitting across from her, nor was there a housekeeper sitting in the shadows. They had found each other again. Outside, the wind whispered through the towering oaks, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. This time there was no regret, no loss, only family. And that, above all else, was what truly mattered.